In the depths of ancient libraries, hidden beneath layers of dust and secrecy, lies a mystery that has captivated the human imagination for over 2,000 years. It is a quest that consumed kings and paupers alike, a dream that drove edge of madness, and a legend brilliant minds to thread that promised the ultimate prize, the power to transform worthless metal into gleaming gold, to cure any disease, and to cheat death itself. This is not the story of a fairy tale or a children's book about wizards. This is the true story of the Philosopher's Stone, a quest so powerful that it gave birth to modern science itself, and a secret so dangerous that those who claim to possess it wrote their formulas in codes that remain unbroken to this day. But here is what they never tell you in the history books. The alchemists were not fools chasing impossible dreams. They were brilliant scientists, centuries ahead of their time, who discovered fundamental truths about the nature of reality that we are only now beginning to understand. And the most shocking revelation of all? In the 21st century, we have actually achieved what the ancient masters could only dream of. We have learned to transmute elements, to turn one substance into another, including the legendary transformation of base metals into gold. The question is no longer whether the Philosopher's Stone was real. The question is why its true story has been hidden from us for so long, and what the ancient alchemists really discovered in their secret laboratories. To understand the true power of this legendary substance, we must journey back to a time when the boundaries between science and magic had not yet been drawn. We must enter the world of the first alchemists, where every experiment was an act of faith, and every discovery brought them one step closer to unlocking the deepest secrets of creation itself. The story begins in the shadowy workshops of ancient Egypt, where priest-scientists worked by candlelight, mixing strange substances and recording their observations in hieroglyphs that few could read. These were not primitive experiments. These were sophisticated investigations into the fundamental nature of matter, conducted by some of the most brilliant minds in human history. But the Egyptians were not working alone. Their knowledge came from an even older source, a tradition so ancient that its origins are lost in the mists of prehistory. The Greeks called it the Hermetic tradition, named after the mysterious figure of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, who was said to possess all the secrets of heaven and earth. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in the 4th century before Christ, something extraordinary happened. Greek-Egyptian mysticism, and from rationalism, met this collision of civilizations, a new science was born. It was here, in the cosmopolitan city of Alexandria, that the first true alchemists began their work. One of the earliest of these pioneers was Zosimos of Panopolis, a man whose writings would influence seekers for the next 1,500 years. Zosimos spoke of a substance he called the stone that is not a stone, a paradox that would echo through the centuries. He described visions of divine beings who revealed to him the secrets of transformation, not just of metals, but of the human soul itself. This was the crucial insight that modern historians often miss. For the ancient alchemists, the transformation of lead into gold was never just about creating wealth. It was a symbol, a metaphor for the transformation of the human spirit from its base, corrupt state into something pure and eternal. The laboratory was a temple, and every experiment was a form of prayer. As the centuries passed, this sacred knowledge spread along the trade routes of the ancient world. It traveled from Egypt to Byzantium, from Persia to the courts of the Islamic caliphs, gathering new insights and techniques at every stop. Each culture that encountered it added their own understanding, their own discoveries, their own mysteries. In the 8th century, in the golden age of Islamic civilization, a brilliant scholar named Jabir ibn Hayyan would revolutionize the entire field. Known to the West as Geber, he was perhaps the greatest experimental scientist of his age. Jabir took the mystical traditions of the ancients and subjected them to rigorous investigation. He developed the theory that all metals were composed of two fundamental principles: sulfur, representing the fiery, masculine principle, and mercury, representing the fluid, feminine principle. By manipulating the balance of these elements, he believed any metal could be transformed into any other. It was a theory so elegant, so compelling, that it would dominate Western thought for the next 800 years. But Jabir did more than theorize. He experimented relentlessly, developing new techniques for distillation, sublimation, and calcination. His laboratory was filled with apparatus that would be recognizable to any modern chemist: retorts, alembics, furnaces, and crucibles. He discovered numerous chemical compounds, developed new methods for producing acids, and laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. Most importantly, Jabir coined a new term for the substance that could facilitate these transformations. He called it elixir, from which we get our modern word elixir. This was the Philosopher's Stone by another name, the universal solvent, the key that could unlock all the doors of nature. When this knowledge finally reached medieval Europe in the 12th century, it arrived like a thunderbolt. Islamic texts were translated into Latin with breathless excitement, and suddenly every scholar, every monk, every curious nobleman wanted to learn the secrets of the ancient art. The descriptions they found were tantalizing and contradictory. The stone was said to appear as a red powder, heavy as gold, but soluble in any liquid. Others described it as transparent and glass-like, somewhere between red and purple in color. Some claimed it was orange, like saffron, when ground to powder. The accounts varied, but they all agreed on one thing: this substance possessed powers beyond human comprehension. The stone could transmute base metals into gold or silver, depending on its preparation. The white variety was said to produce silver, while the red could create gold. But its powers went far beyond mere transmutation. The ancients believed it could cure any disease, extend human life indefinitely, and even grant immortality to those pure enough to receive its gifts. These were not idle boasts. The alchemical texts were filled with detailed instructions, complex procedures that required months or even years to complete. They spoke of multiple distillations, of careful temperature control, of precise timing aligned with the movements of the planets. This was serious science, conducted by people who believed they were uncovering the fundamental laws of the universe. As the medieval period progressed, the search for the Philosopher's Stone became an obsession that gripped the imagination of Europe. Kings funded alchemical research, hoping to solve their financial problems by transmuting lead into gold. Scholars dedicated their lives to deciphering the cryptic texts of the ancient masters, and in laboratories scattered across the continent, brilliant minds worked in secrecy, convinced that they were on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. But the alchemists faced a problem that would plague them for centuries. How could they share their knowledge without revealing their secrets to the unworthy? How could they record their discoveries without making them available to charlatans and fools who might misuse such dangerous power? Their solution was both brilliant and frustrating. They developed an elaborate system of codes, symbols, and metaphors that concealed their true meaning from all but the most dedicated students. Their manuscripts became puzzles within puzzles, layered with multiple meanings that could take a lifetime to unravel. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the entire story. The alchemists were not just hiding their formulas from casual observers. They were protecting something far more valuable than gold. They were protecting a worldview that challenged the very foundations of medieval society. In an age where the Church held absolute authority over all matters of knowledge and truth, the alchemists were quietly developing ideas that would eventually shatter the established order. The secret they guarded so carefully was not just a recipe for making gold. It was a revolutionary understanding of matter itself, a glimpse into the atomic nature of reality that would not be formally recognized by mainstream science for another 600 years. They had discovered that the elements were not immutable. that the boundaries between substances were far more fluid than anyone imagined. This knowledge was dangerous in ways that modern minds can barely comprehend. To suggest that matter could be transformed, that the fundamental building blocks of creation could be rearranged by human hands, was to challenge the divine order itself. It implied that humans could possess powers that were supposed to belong to God alone. And so they wrote in riddles. They spoke of green lions devouring the sun, of royal marriages between opposing principles, of deaths and resurrections that took place in glass vessels. To the uninitiated, these texts seemed like the ravings of madmen. But to those who possessed the key, they were precise scientific instructions disguised as mystical poetry. One man who claimed to possess this key was Nicolas Flamel, a humble bookseller who lived in 14th century Paris. According to the legends that grew up around him, Flamel had acquired a mysterious ancient text, bound in copper plates and filled with strange symbols that no scholar could decipher. For years, this book sat in his shop, taunting him with its secrets. Then, in 1378, Flamel claimed to have met a Jewish scholar who had been forced to convert to Christianity during one of the periodic waves of persecution that swept through medieval Europe. This man, well versed in the mystical traditions of the Kabbalah, looked at Flamel's mysterious book and smiled. He recognized it immediately as one of the great works of alchemical wisdom, and he agreed to help the bookseller unlock its secrets. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries. According to Flamel's own account, written years later, he and the Jewish scholar worked together to decode the ancient text. The process took months of careful study, but eventually they succeeded in understanding its cryptic instructions. On January 17th, 1382, Flamel claimed to have achieved the impossible. Following the procedures outlined in the ancient book, he had successfully transmuted 1/2 pound of mercury into pure silver. 3 months later, he repeated the process, this time transforming mercury into gold. The historical record shows that around this time, Nicolas Flamel did indeed come into considerable wealth. He began making substantial donations to churches and charitable institutions, funding the construction of hospitals and schools. His house, which still stands in Paris today as the oldest stone building in the city, became a pilgrimage site for aspiring alchemists from across Europe. But Flamel was careful never to reveal the exact nature of his discovery. His published works were filled with the same symbolic language that characterized all alchemical texts. He spoke of philosophical mercury and sulfur, of the marriage of opposites, of the birth of the stone in the belly of the furnace. To casual readers, these seemed like meaningless metaphors, but to those who understood the code, they were detailed instructions for the great work. The legend of Nicolas Flamel inspired countless imitators, but few achieved his level of success or notoriety. Most alchemists labored in obscurity, spending their fortunes on expensive equipment and rare materials, chasing dreams that seemed always just beyond their grasp. Yet the work continued, driven by something deeper than mere greed. The alchemists had glimpsed a truth about the nature of reality that conventional science would not accept for centuries. They understood that matter and energy were interchangeable, that the elements were not permanent and unchanging, that the universe itself was a vast laboratory where transformations were taking place on scales both cosmic and microscopic. This insight found its most sophisticated expression in the work of a Swiss physician known to history as Paracelsus. Born Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, he adopted the name Paracelsus to indicate that he considered himself superior to the ancient Roman physician Celsus. Paracelsus was a revolutionary figure who challenged virtually every aspect of medieval medical practice. Where traditional physicians relied on the classical texts of antiquity, Paracelsus insisted on direct observation and experimentation. Where they sought to balance the 4 humors of the body, he developed new treatments based on chemical principles derived from alchemy. Most importantly, Paracelsus understood that the same forces that governed the transformation of metals in the laboratory were at work in the human body. Disease, he argued, was simply a form of corruption that could be corrected through the application of the right chemical remedy. The Philosopher's Stone was not just a tool for transmuting metals. It was the key to perfecting human health and extending life indefinitely. This medical alchemy represented a profound shift in thinking about the relationship between mind and body, between the spiritual and the material. Paracelsus saw no distinction between the laboratory and the hospital, between chemical transformation and spiritual healing. For him, the alchemist was a physician of both body and soul, working to restore the divine harmony that sin and corruption had disrupted. But perhaps the most surprising figure in the history of the Philosopher's Stone was a man known primarily for his contributions to physics and mathematics. Sir Isaac Newton, the discoverer of the laws of motion and universal gravitation, spent more time studying alchemy than he did developing his famous theories of mechanics. Newton's alchemical manuscripts, hidden from public view for centuries after his death, reveal a mind obsessed with the ancient art. He copied out thousands of pages from classical alchemical texts, conducted his own experiments in a private laboratory, and developed elaborate theories about the nature of matter that would not be fully understood until the dawn of the atomic age. What Newton discovered in his secret studies was that the alchemists had been pursuing something far more sophisticated than simple gold-making. They had intuited the existence of forces that held matter together at the most fundamental level, the same forces that Newton would later describe in his theory of gravitation. The connection was not accidental. Newton believed that the same attractive force that caused an apple to fall from a tree was responsible for the cohesion of particles within atoms. The alchemical concept of sympathies and antipathies between different substances was, in Newton's mind, an early recognition of what we now call electromagnetic forces. This revolutionary insight remained hidden in Newton's private papers, encrypted in the same symbolic language that had protected alchemical secrets for centuries. It would take another 200 years before mainstream science would catch up with what the master alchemists had glimpsed in their laboratories. The irony is profound. While the Church condemned alchemy as devil worship, and later scientists dismissed it as primitive superstition, the alchemists were actually developing the conceptual framework that would eventually give rise to modern chemistry and atomic physics. They understood that matter was composed of invisible particles that could be rearranged and recombined. They recognized that different substances contained different amounts of a fundamental energy that could be released and harnessed. They even suspected that the elements themselves were not eternal and unchanging, but were simply different arrangements of more basic components. These insights, expressed in the symbolic language of medieval mysticism, would eventually be validated by the atomic theory of the 19th century and the nuclear physics of the 20th. The alchemists had been right all along. The elements could be transmuted, matter could be converted into energy, and the secrets of creation could be unlocked by human intelligence and determination. The vindication would come in the most unexpected way, not through mystical revelation or ancient wisdom, but through the cold precision of 20th century physics. In 1901, a young scientist named Ernest Rutherford was working with his colleague Frederick Soddy in a laboratory at McGill University in Montreal. They were studying the mysterious phenomenon of radioactivity, a force that had been discovered only a few years earlier by Marie and Pierre Curie. What they observed defied everything that science thought it knew about the nature of matter. They were watching thorium, element by element, atom by atom, spontaneously transform itself into radium. The elements, those supposedly eternal and unchanging building blocks of creation, were literally changing their identity before their eyes. Soddy, who had studied the history of alchemy as a hobby, immediately grasped the profound implications of what they were witnessing. In a moment of pure excitement, he shouted across the laboratory, "Rutherford, This is transmutation. The older scientist, mindful of their scientific reputations, snapped back with characteristic caution. For Christ's sake, Soddy, don't call it transmutation. They'll have our heads off as alchemists. But the word had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. For the first time in human history, scientists had observed the spontaneous transmutation of elements, the very process that the alchemists had spent centuries trying to achieve. The ancient dream was not impossible after all. It was simply a matter of understanding the forces that operated at the heart of the atom itself. The implications were staggering. If elements could transform spontaneously through radioactive decay, then perhaps they could be made to transform through human intervention. The alchemical dream of artificial transmutation was no longer a fantasy. It was a scientific possibility waiting to be explored. The breakthrough came during the Second World War, when the urgent demands of the atomic bomb project forced scientists to develop new techniques for manipulating matter at the nuclear level. In 1941, 3 American physicists, Ruby Sher, Kenneth Bainbridge, and Herbert Anderson, achieved what Nicholas Flamel had claimed to do 5 centuries earlier. They successfully transmuted mercury into gold. The process was nothing like the mystical procedures described in the ancient texts. Instead of philosophical mercury and sulfur, they used neutron bombardment in a nuclear reactor. Instead of months of careful preparation, the transformation took place in microseconds. But the result was identical. Base metal had been transformed into precious metal through human art and knowledge. The quantities were microscopic, far too small to be economically viable. The energy required for the process was enormous, making each atom of artificial gold worth millions of times more than naturally occurring gold. But that was not the point. The point was that it could be done at all. The alchemists had been vindicated by atomic physics. In the decades that followed, nuclear transmutation became routine. Scientists learned to create elements that had never existed on Earth, extending the periodic table far beyond what nature had provided. They discovered that with enough energy, any element could theoretically be transformed into any other element. The Philosopher's Stone, it turned out, was not a mysterious powder or elixir. It was knowledge itself, the understanding of nuclear forces that the ancient masters could only dream of. Modern particle accelerators became the alchemical laboratories of the 21st century. At CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, scientists routinely create gold from lead, just as the medieval texts had promised. The Large Hadron Collider, that massive underground ring of superconducting magnets, is perhaps the most sophisticated philosopher's stone ever devised. In 2002, CERN scientists reported producing minute quantities of gold through high-energy collisions of lead nuclei. The process was repeated in 2004 and again in 2022, each time with greater precision and understanding. By 2025, the ALICE experiment at the Large Hadron Collider had perfected techniques for nuclear transmutation that would have seemed like pure magic to the ancient alchemists. But the modern physicists had an advantage that their medieval predecessors lacked. They understood the true nature of matter at the atomic level. They knew that gold and lead were not fundamentally different substances, but simply different arrangements of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Change the number of protons in a nucleus, and you change the element itself. This insight revealed why the alchemical quest had been so frustrating for so many centuries. The medieval masters were trying to achieve nuclear transmutation using chemical methods. It was like trying to rewrite a book by rearranging the letters on the page, without understanding that the meaning lay in the words themselves. The alchemists had been working at the wrong level of reality. They were manipulating molecules when they needed to be manipulating atomic nuclei. They were using the tools of chemistry to attempt the work of nuclear physics. Their failure was not a failure of vision or determination. It was simply a limitation of the technology available to them. Yet their theoretical framework had been remarkably sophisticated. The concept of prima materia, the first matter from which all elements were derived, anticipated the modern understanding of subatomic particles. The idea that metals were composed of sulfur and mercury principles was a primitive but accurate recognition that elements have internal structure. The belief that transmutation was possible was absolutely correct. Even more remarkably, some of the medieval alchemists had intuited the connection between matter and energy that would not be formally expressed until Einstein's famous equation E equals mc squared. They understood that the Philosopher's Stone was not really about creating gold. It was about accessing the fundamental forces that held matter together. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the entire story. If the alchemists were so close to understanding the true nature of matter, why did their work remain hidden for so long? Why were their insights dismissed as superstition and fantasy when they contained genuine scientific wisdom? The answer lies in the dual nature of the alchemical tradition itself. The ancient masters were not just proto-scientists. They were also mystics and philosophers who saw their work as a spiritual discipline. They believed that the transformation of metals was inseparably linked to the transformation of the human soul. You could not achieve one without achieving the other. This integration of science and spirituality made their work suspect to both religious authorities and later secular scientists. The Church condemned alchemy because it seemed to claim divine powers for human beings. Enlightenment thinkers dismissed it because it mixed empirical observation with mystical speculation. But the alchemists themselves saw no contradiction between these different approaches to truth. For them, the laboratory was a sacred space where the laws of nature revealed themselves to those who approached with the right combination of intellectual rigor and spiritual purity. The Philosopher's Stone was both a physical substance and a metaphor for enlightenment itself. This holistic approach to knowledge is perhaps the most relevant aspect of alchemy for our own time. As modern science becomes increasingly specialized and fragmented, the alchemical vision of integrated wisdom offers a compelling alternative. The ancient masters understood that the same principles that governed the transformation of matter also governed the transformation of consciousness. Recent developments in quantum physics have begun to validate this intuition. The discovery that observation affects reality at the subatomic level suggests that consciousness and matter are more intimately connected than classical physics had assumed. The alchemical idea that the experimenter and the experiment are part of a single system no longer seems quite so mystical. Moreover, the environmental crisis has forced scientists to confront the ethical implications of their work in ways that would have been familiar to the medieval alchemists. The power to transmute elements, to manipulate matter at the nuclear level, brings with it tremendous responsibility. The same knowledge that enables us to create gold in particle accelerators also enables us to create nuclear weapons. The alchemists understood this connection between knowledge and wisdom, between power and responsibility. They insisted that the great work could only be accomplished by those who had first purified themselves, who had achieved the moral and spiritual development necessary to handle such dangerous secrets safely. Their system of codes and symbols was not just about protecting trade secrets. It was about ensuring that transformative knowledge remained in the hands of those who could be trusted to use it wisely. In an age when scientific knowledge is spreading faster than human wisdom, this ancient concern seems remarkably prescient. The true legacy of the Philosopher's Stone is not the ability to make gold, which modern technology has rendered economically pointless. It is the recognition that the deepest truths about reality can only be discovered by those who approach them with both rigorous intellect and ethical commitment. The medieval alchemists were the last generation of scientists who saw no separation between knowledge and wisdom, between understanding nature and understanding themselves. Their laboratories were temples, their experiments were prayers, and their ultimate goal was not wealth or power, but the perfection of human nature itself. In our own age of artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, of climate change and nuclear proliferation, we desperately need to recover this integrated vision. The technical knowledge to transform matter, to manipulate life, to reshape the planet itself, is now within our grasp. The question is whether we have the wisdom to use these powers responsibly. The alchemists spent centuries searching for a substance that could transmute base metals into gold. What they discovered instead was something far more valuable. They found that the real transformation takes place not in the crucible, but in the mind and heart of the seeker. The true Philosopher's Stone is not a powder or an elixir, but the integration of knowledge and wisdom, of power and responsibility, of science and ethics. This is the secret that the ancient masters encoded in their cryptic texts. This is the treasure they hid behind layers of symbols and metaphors. And this is the legacy that awaits us, if we have the courage to continue their great work in our own time. The quest for the Philosopher's Stone is far from over. It has simply taken new forms, addressing new challenges, seeking new transformations. The laboratory equipment has changed, the theoretical framework has evolved, but the essential questions remain the same. How do we transform the base metal of human nature into something precious? How do we transmute ignorance into wisdom, fear into love, division into unity? These are the real secrets of the Philosopher's Stone, and they are as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The answers to these eternal questions may be closer than we imagine, but to find them, we must look beyond the dusty manuscripts and ancient laboratories. We must examine what happened when the alchemical dream finally escaped the confines of history and entered the realm of popular imagination. In 1997, a British author named Joanne Rowling introduced the world to a young wizard named Harry Potter. The very first book in her series was titled Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and it featured none other than Nicholas Flamel himself, the medieval alchemist we encountered earlier. But Rowling's version of Flamel was not a historical figure shrouded in mystery. He was a living character, 665 years old, who had achieved immortality through the power of the stone. This fictional portrayal did something that centuries of scholarly research had failed to accomplish. It brought the legend of the Philosopher's Stone into the consciousness of an entire generation. Millions of children around the world suddenly knew the name of Nicholas Flamel. They understood that the stone could grant eternal life. They grasped the fundamental concept that had driven the alchemical quest for millennia. But Rowling's interpretation also revealed something profound about our modern relationship with the ancient mysteries. In her story, the Philosopher's Stone is ultimately destroyed, not because it is evil, but because it is too dangerous. The character of Dumbledore explains that immortality is not necessarily a blessing, that death gives meaning to life, that some powers are too great for mortals to wield responsibly. This fictional destruction of the stone mirrors what happened to alchemy itself in the real world. As science advanced and the mechanistic worldview took hold, the integrated wisdom of the ancient masters was deliberately abandoned. The spiritual dimension of the great work was dismissed as superstition. The ethical framework that had governed alchemical practice was discarded as irrelevant. What remained was pure technique, divorced from meaning or purpose. Modern chemistry inherited the experimental methods of the alchemists, but rejected their philosophical insights. Nuclear physics achieved their wildest dreams of transmutation while ignoring their warnings about the moral requirements for such power. The result has been a world of unprecedented technological capability coupled with spiritual poverty. We can split atoms and manipulate genes, but we struggle to find meaning in our existence. We can communicate instantly across vast distances, but we cannot seem to understand one another. We can extend human life through medical intervention, but we cannot answer the question of what makes life worth living. The ancient alchemists would not have been surprised by this predicament. They always insisted that external transformation, without internal transformation, was not just useless, but dangerous. They understood that the power to change the world could only be safely exercised by those who had first changed themselves. This insight takes on new urgency in our age of artificial intelligence and biotechnology. We are on the verge of creating machines that can think, of designing organisms that have never existed, of extending human consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual brains. These capabilities make the medieval dream of transmuting lead into gold seem almost quaint by comparison. Yet we approach these revolutionary technologies with the same fragmented mindset that has characterized modern science for centuries. We focus on what we can do without asking whether we should do it. We pursue efficiency without considering purpose. We seek power without cultivating wisdom. And so we return to where we began, standing in the shadowy depths of those ancient libraries, surrounded by the whispered secrets of centuries. The Philosopher's Stone was never just about gold. It was never just about immortality. It was about something far more precious and far more dangerous. It was about the transformation of human consciousness itself. The alchemists understood what we have forgotten in our rush toward technological mastery. True power lies not in our ability to manipulate the external world, but in our capacity to transform ourselves. The real great work was never conducted in crucibles and retorts. It was conducted in the laboratory of the human heart. Their legacy lives on, not in the particle accelerators of CERN or the nuclear reactors that can transmute elements at will, but in the eternal questions they dared to ask. How do we become worthy of the knowledge we possess? How do we ensure that our power serves wisdom rather than mere ambition? How do we transform the base metal of human nature into something that can safely wield the forces of creation itself? These questions echo through our digital age with the same urgency they possessed in medieval laboratories. As we stand on the threshold of capabilities that would have seemed godlike to the ancients, we desperately need to recover their integrated vision of knowledge and wisdom, power and responsibility, science and spirit. The true Philosopher's Stone was never lost. It was never hidden in cryptic manuscripts or buried in forgotten tombs. It has always been within our reach, waiting patiently for us to understand that the greatest transformation is not the one that happens in our laboratories, but the one that happens within ourselves. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the hidden history of human ambition and wisdom. If this story has awakened something within you, if it has made you question what we might be missing in our modern pursuit of knowledge, then subscribe to continue exploring these forgotten mysteries that still shape our world today.